Hello YouTube. Just wanted to do a quick little video. As I said, I try to make these quite frequent as I can on the Tuesdays now, or even try to record them on Tuesdays, so that way you're not waiting for forever and ever and ever for me to release one when I can be asked. But for this one, this is a little bit off topic to the original one I was going to do. I got asked on Instagram a very fun question, actually, a very interesting question, which I thought I might want to cover in for this video. Yesterday on Instagram, I was asked by a follower of mine called Tanya, and she messaged me asking a question about which I thought would be quite interesting, and I think that this does need to be addressed to an extent. So, Tanya replies, "Hi again, so I'm writing to you because I've watched some of your YouTube videos and you seem to have a good depth knowledge when it comes to goth music and goth history origin. Thank you. I'm trying to write something about misconceptions when it comes to bands being dubbed goth by mainstream media when they're actually not. Evanescence, Within Temptation, Nightwish, a range of metal/emo bands. I would like to explain it in terms of origin and how to spot the differences between the genres when it comes to the sound. To me, who has listened to goth for a very long time, it is kind of weird that somebody would confuse goth, emo and metal because they sound totally different. For instance, Sister Mercy and Frozen Autumn or The Cure, for that matter, are quite different, but you can hear a similarity of some kind. Do you agree? And if so, how would you describe this special sound?" So in this case, it's a case of I do understand when people do confuse like metal or emo, for that matter, for goth, and obviously because goth and metal have got the crossover subgenre, which is gothic metal, which I'll be going into in a moment. She does go on to say afterwards, and also when it comes to symphonic metal like Within Temptation, Nightwish, and gothic metal bands like Tristania, I often meet people, even long-time goths, who are dead set on these are goth bands, because the aesthetic and because their music has gothic influence. Would you explain the differences between these bands in terms of origin of the genre? Remember you talked about something like this with emo and goth in one of your videos, but I can't remember which one it was. Reaction challenge. P.S. If something I say doesn't make sense, please let me know. I tend to make it a lot. Emoji. No, that was absolutely fine, and to be honest, it's a perfectly good question. So, as far as like this whole misconception, let's start on the first basic principle. So let's start on the main thing, like gothic metal, for example. I know many people who are on both sides of this spectrum.
What the fuck is this out there?
Who support it on that side, saying that yes, it is part of the evolution of gothic music for the 90s blueprint of the umbrella term. Then you got the typical side saying that no, it should not exist, it's only for an aesthetic purpose, etc. Blah 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 blah. To understand like how gothic metal came about, but this is only my personal depiction. I could be wrong, and the scholars of gothic history had enough from the industrial one. I said that was my personal depiction of where I thought it would come from. So this is only my personal depiction as where I think this will come from. During the 90s, when goth seemed to look like it was having a midlife crisis, basically, because you still had some of the trad bands still existing, but they were kind of more or less going underground compared to its more commercial recognition within the underground scene itself. So during the 90s, Fields and Nephilim were a lot more recognisable, same as The Mission. Sister Mercy went through that god-awful Vision Things album. But then you also had bands like Rosetta Stone as well, who was still quite prominent in that scene in the 90s. But then, obviously, during the 90s, that's when you also had the new evolution of gothic music, such as like the industrial commercialization, which also kind of led up to EBM, industrial, cyber goth, all that type of stuff, which helped play a part during the 90s transformation, which is now why we got cyber goths and EBMs a lot more prominent. I would say nowadays, but that was more like 10 years ago. But same thing with gothic metal. And gothic metal as a subgenre itself originated from England in the 1990s, which had the typical metal style, the metal structure, the metal repertoire, but it also heavily inclusive into the Gothic aesthetic, the Gothic literature, the Gothic lyrics, all that type of stuff. So it helped merge into one. And the way how I like to think of Gothic metal when it comes to which branch of the tree comes from, to me it's part of two different type of trees. You have the Gothic, or the Goth tree basically, which includes Gothic as an aesthetic, or as it means from its depiction from literature and the influence it brought up through up the roots. And then you got the metal, and obviously the metal branch I'd say is a lot more stronger than the actual Gothic branch, but they kind of entwine into one branch, kind of led up. You tend to see on trees which are close compacted. So that's what I see. It's a subfusion genre of these two. Now, where people would kind of like get all bitchy about it, where it goes,
no, it's only metal, there's no proper goth in it.
Well, that's up for debate and that's up for personal representation. But if you ask me, as I said, every decade or so, the goth, or like any genre itself for that matter of argument, it changes. So every 10 years or so, music is going to change its format. It's going to evolve, and it's going to regenerate, shall we say. It's going to come out with something new. It's going to change its shape, change its style, like any type of like musical style or even like a fashion trend. But without trying to disrespect on that matter, it's the best representation I could give. So with me, it's a case of it's bound to happen. I mean, what I find interesting in the format of Gothic metal is a lot of it comes from the origins of doom metal, which I do find plays a solid caricature. And obviously, if you know your metal history, doom metal's influence from Black Sabbath's early Blueprint days. So I can see where the doom aspect would come in, which plays a big difference to say that and symphonic metal. While symphonic metal tends to be a lot more operatic, falsetto type of vocals, faster tempoed songs per se, and just the overall lyrical depictions a lot more different to say Gothic metal. But what I like about the Gothic metal sound are two main aspects, which I think brings itself more towards that type of relation to Gothic, excluding lyrical content, because lyrical content would fall into that category easily. I mean, Cradle of Filth used a lot of vampiric and Gothic literature to influence their first few albums, which was Gothic black metal era, which is once again another subgenre. But take away the influence from these novels and these type of like aesthetics, and I find that you get two main important things. The first one's a bit contradicting when they say that's what's the connection between like Gothic metal and its roots of goth rock. The funny thing is though, during the 80s, a lot of these goth bands like would use synthesizers. Very good example, like The Cure and Killing Joke use those for examples. But then during the 90s, when Gothic metal was kind of brooding, they took away that kind of shoegazy type of synth sound and replaced it more with an open church choir type of sound. So you had this almost aesthetic, which you can hear, this depiction of like a big, broad, Gothic-y church type of homage, this type of sound that kind of sets the mood for what Gothic metal would, this type of sound for. And to me, the most important one for this one is what I call the Beauty and the Beast technique. It's a format where, especially in Gothic metal bands, especially when they've got female fronted singers, like Lacuna Coil for example, where you have one, the female singer who's represented as the beauty, this clean vocaled, lovely melodic way of singing, and then you have, say, the male, this type of beast vocal style, which is more rougher on the edges, that depiction between innocence and savagery, the light and the dark, the pure and the sin. That's the type of depiction that I find is quite important to Gothic metal itself. And you can hear this for a good example, such as Lacuna Coil's song Heaven's a Lie. If you listen the whole song through, you'll hear that abrupt church sounds, those the choir in the background. You can hear the doom-inspired slow riffs, the hard chugging, the slow tempo, and then you hear Christina Scabbia's voice, this soothing, melancholic voice sliver into our eardrums and seductive, and then during the chorus you'd hear Andrea's voice, this belting, rough, passionate male voice, and it's in contrast to me in that type of style. And many other Gothic bands do this. Paradise Lost is a very good example. They were kind of like the ones to set off the blueprints of Gothic metal, as well as My Dying Bride. But I just wanted to use that as my first example, to me, what I think of Gothic metal when I listen to this. And to me, that's how I kind of see Gothic metal. So it takes one aspect away, but also introduces not a goth blueprint, but a Gothic blueprint, this aestheticness of using like the church references, these metaphors, these cross-history convergences into the subgenre. And it's a very good depiction of it, actually. I like the way how Gothic metal has got this like own stand of itself. It's not just seen as a subgenre from metal or doom metal, it's kind of stand out its own way, and it's one that crosses between both trees again, between both labels. So it's a case of, I know many people when they're getting into goth, they've listened to Gothic metal bands. Most of the time it's Cradle of Filth, which is black metal, but we can sometimes accept that one. But if you're going to go through stuff like Lacuna Coil and all these other Gothic bands, and it does help kind of set your way, so you're not just limited to that matter. And this is what I like when you have like elders in their 40s and 50s who acknowledge like Gothic metal acts and symphonic acts, and they're open to this change of depiction, this new change in the style of music. And I think that's very important, especially once a subculture to move ahead. You can't always just stick to the originals. If goth was always going to be trad goth, then it would not progress and the subculture would have died out many years ago. So you will need to change the music, introduce two different styles of music, and that way, when people are introduced into that one style, they can end up going down the roots of where it all came from. And to me, that's important. I think that from a music-based subculture, that the subculture itself changes every 10 years, so does the music, but it doesn't mean that you have to disregard how people found themselves into that music. And obviously, touching a little bit on the emo one, you do tend to get this problem, especially with third wave emo, where the commercialization of like Gothic aesthetic in the 90s became a lot more prominent through stuff like the Sandman comics and the Crow and the Nightmare Before Christmas stuff, which kind of gave this new type of brood of emo, third wave emo as I call it, where they use more like a Gothic aesthetic, but not so much in relation to the music. So this is why I've always had a problem with emo being depicted with the Gothic subculture, purely because there's no direct relation, it's all from an aesthetic purpose, which is the difference between Gothic metal and emo. The other question about, would you explain the difference between these bands in terms of origin of the genre, about symphonic metal and Gothic metal? I think I touched out already about the differences between the subgenres. They're very close together. Loads of people who were into the second wave of goth subculture, what I call the Gothic metal era, they would be introduced into these other bands through like a symphonic introduction through the metal roots. These are people who would listen to, say, metal first and then find Gothic metal, and then they'll explore more into the goth genre. But when it comes to saying that aesthetic and Gothic influences, it all depends on the context. If you were to, say, look at a band that uses high Gothic context in the songs, a lot of relations, a lot of structural writing of songs and the way how it portrays the story, you can kind of say that's Gothic to the extent. It's all a lot to do with lyrical annotation and the way how it pays an homage to the Gothic literature and aesthetics, as well as the music as well. So as far as symphonic metal goes, which does have very close similarities to Gothic metal, but there are going to be differences, and some bands will end up crossing paths, like within Temptation, for example. They're Gothic but yet symphonic at the same time. Whilst with Nightwish, they tend to be more symphonic because of the tempo of their music, the speed of their music. Well, it's both the same thing, tempo and speed. But then you also got their lyrical annotation, which is less Lovecraftian or Bram Stoker-ish, and tells more of a symphonic story, which is more rooted, I suppose, to like Celtic way of telling a story, but that's my opinion. But you do have many goths that do tend to listen to symphonic metal as well, just as you have many goths that listen to horror punk and all those other type of cross genres that would bring them into the introduction. But then it's also the person's responsibility or their choice to decide if they want to look straight into it. If you just want to listen to the Murder Dolls and Marilyn Manson for 5 years and not look any more into it, then that's your choice. And obviously, I find it important that if you are to go into a subculture and you're introduced to one way, I find it important to dig a little bit deeper. You might surprise yourself in what you can find. Anyhow, I just thought I would answer this one with a full video. It's an interesting one because I don't really talk much about Gothic metal on this one, and there are very few YouTubers that I do see that cover this, so I just wanted to give my depiction on this one, and as said, there are similarities, there are also big differences, but in the end it helps converge them all together. And I hope they enjoyed this. Sorry if it seems like a bit of a half rant. I was literally given this last night, so I didn't have too much time to prepare it for this one. So I hope that you enjoy this. Give me a thumbs up if you like it, give it a thumbs down if you didn't. Be sure to check out my next videos. I'm not going to bother to like, share and subscribe, I'm not that desperate. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll hopefully see you very soon. Bye.